as I said, this is a short presentation based on my book, Nature in Mind. I'm slightly unusual in the kind of family therapy world in that I've come to family therapy from a background of biology and a sort of deep interest in what biology was really about. Through working with young people outside and then gradually coming into camp. So I've come, in a way, my journey has been quite different from a lot of people who get into therapy and then want to take people outside. I've taken people outside, now I've come into a clinic setting. But that's kind of work for me. So let me just show you my presentation. So what's the issue today? Well, the issue is we're living in the context of ecological collapse, catastrophic climate change, species extinction, global pandemics, all pretty scary. And I listen to a lot of podcasts, and how we dealt with the pandemic as a global response to something which was serious but not devastating as climate change might be, was pretty weak, really. So and if we kind of imagined that we were going to have a pandemic that was going to be global, before last year, it would have been unimaginable. And that's kind of what we're looking at. And I suppose the question is, what is the how can we orientate ourselves as systemic family therapists to that kind of crisis, because people are dealing with it in different ways. So what is the system that needs to change? So one of the things that I've been exploring is this idea of narrative collapse. The idea that the kind of story that we've been running, the kind of software we've been running as the Western world, has kind of run out. It's kind of out of date, and it's an implicit narrative, and it's what's implicit in the narrative, in the conversation, is this modernist materialist epistemology, or way of knowing, based on the work of it's influenced very strongly by two dead white guys, René Descartes, Mind and Matter, who separates our thinking from our bodies, and separates thinking from all other matter, really. And Charles Darwin, who we're running an idea of Darwinian evolution based on survival. And while in many ways there's truth in the Darwinian explanation, it marginalizes anything that it marginalizes half of life, really, which is the other part that doesn't survive, which is all part of the it's all part of the ecosystem. So this modernist view is the strongly held belief that the world, including other humans, is made up of discrete physical objects, and if we analyze and think about them enough, all knowledge will become available. And one of the problems with this is we begin to lose our curiosity, because we're seeing the world as purely mechanistic, and it leads to a loss of relationship with nature. This picture of the two biologists are measuring a sea lion, and that's we kind of take that on board, but it becomes, if you change the context and imagine they were measuring a dead body that had been washed up, a person. They're measuring it to find out the length of it, rather than being in relationship to a creature that's died. So all our social issues also tend to be linear and first order. I work with the risk management group in Wiltshire, looking at children at risk of exploitation, and they spend a lot of time catching the people who are breaking the law, but they don't spend a lot of time thinking about, well, what are the drivers, what are the internal drivers that draw young people to get into these issues. And of course, Darwinian evolution is embedded in our culture, this idea of improvement, better than, in the picture there, the sort of early hominids aren't quite as good as the later man. The chimpanzees aren't quite as good as the early hominids. There's a sort of implicit hierarchical structure in there, and that really, you know, I think is embedded in Western thought quite implicitly in a way that's really not helpful. So going back to Gregory Bateson, well, he rejected the modernist approach, and it's, you know, I've spent a long time trying to understand Bateson, and he's pretty difficult to understand because he's doing a sort of epistemological rug pulling, but he says logic and quantity tend to be inappropriate devices for describing organisms, their interactions and internal organizations. And what we find is actually, you know, logic and quantity are how the Western world approaches pretty much everything, from CAMs to what's happening on the news, to whether climate change is really happening or not. And he says that doesn't really cut it. The decolonial turn, we've talked about that, and it's really, you know, I think it's overcoming this deep Western habit of seeing the world solely made up of objects and ideas, rather than relationships. The relational part has dropped out. So thinking about eco psychology or eco psychotherapy, taking the long view. So our species has lived for more than 99.97% of our time on Earth in intimate relationship with nature. This is Chellis Glendenning, I just spelled her name wrong there, who's written a book called My Name is Chellis and I'm in Recovery from Western Civilization, which is worth a read. So basically we spent, you know, a huge amount of our time in contact with nature as hunter-gatherers, and of that time we spent, you know, a very small amount of time as kind of pastoralists and farmers, and we're living now in a tiny fraction where we tend to think that, you know, AI is kind of more important than nature, or the screen time is more important than nature, and actually that kind of lie got exposed really by COVID. So what does that mean if we're working with from an eco-psychological perspective? Well, we can reimagine child and adolescent mental health beyond a Western model, beyond a Western educated, industrial, rich and developed, socially constructed perspective, because there is a tendency to try and make people better, to fit back into our culture. And this is what Jared Diamond calls the weird culture, the Western educated, industrialized. So it's helpful to reimagine that and think, well, are we all indigenous people in exile from our hunter-gatherer lifestyle? And if we think that, how does that affect our practice? Is it possible to reclaim an indigenous nature-based paradigm where human culture is held in multiple systemic attachment containers? So I put in here an image from Avatar, which is I don't know how many of you have seen it, but it's a kind of thinly veiled allegory of how Western capitalist world destroys a nature-based, indigenous, spirit-based culture and the interaction between the two. And what's interesting is it's the biggest grossing film of all time because it's just been released in China. And there's the kind of worldwide phenomenon I've come across called PADS, which is post-Avatar depression syndrome, where people relate to the characters, the indigenous culture in Avatar, and actually become depressed. So let's look at some of the things that are common to indigenous cultures, and then we'll take it from there. So first thing is that they tend to be very embodied because there's a lot of contact with nature, a lot of physicality, not a lot of screen time or sitting down. They're extended, the families are extended, so they're less mummy and daddy team, but extended family. The tribe is really important. And of course, in the West, we've all lost our tribes, and we might wonder who's responsible for that or how that happened. Language, nature, rites of passage, stories, ancestors, and the spiritual cosmology. And I'm going to pick up on a couple of things we can work with there. But one of the things I do is work with unaccompanied asylum-seeking refugees, and the language using an interpreter, using their own language is very important, but also their tribal identity is very important as part of their recovery, in fact. So the first thing we can think about from that list is working with the body. So if we separate the body from the mind, then we're making a sort of a Descartesian error, really, because the body and the mind are connected. So I think systemically we can say, yes, we can work with the body. So if we do that, we're widening the systemic lens to include work with the body, which includes trauma, and work with the polyvagal system. And the polyvagal system is very interesting because it's mostly non-verbal. And we can do that in a clinic setting or outside in nature. And the evidence is that the value of working outside in nature is working outside in a social group, but also within a meaningful context. And there's a couple of pictures of some of the work that I did before I trained as a family therapist, working in the woods with complex adolescents for 10 years, doing forestry, and noticed that actually what we spent a lot of time doing was just observing the body of the young people, whether they could engage in the work or not. And that was our way in rather than therapy. And also the farming, they did a lot of land work, and that was in a meaningful context of producing food. The other thing we did was wilderness experience, deep immersion in nature. And again, this is used all over the world therapeutically now, wilderness experience, quite well documented. And it's changing the context. So it takes young people out of a Western culture and puts them in nature for 3 days, bodily. So you take all your food, you walk, and one of the eco-psychologist authors came to the conclusion that a Western culture is only 3 days deep, because if you take people out after 3 days, they begin to think, they begin to lose their worries about home and begin to think about nature in a more systemic way, as it were. So the other thing I want to explore is the story, restoring the world, trying to widening the systemic lens to include working with the imaginal in nature, and I'll explain what the imaginal is in a moment. The imaginal is essentially the non-languaged and the non-physical, non-sensed. So that embracing the imaginal basically takes the systemic lens closer to the psychodynamic perspective and psychoanalytic perspective, but also the deep ecological perspectives. And I put here family therapy logo, AFT logo, which is the Celtic knot, which is the web of weird, really. It's the description of the net of connection. And I've compared that to an Aboriginal painting of the dream time. And again, you've got these connections and the nodes and the levels. So making sense of complex systems. Well, if we take away our Western view, our thinking, what are we left with? Frank Egler was the ecologist. He influenced Rachel Carson around that time. I don't know if he had contact with Bateson, probably did. He says, nature is more complicated than you think. It is more complicated than you can think. In other words, if we want to understand nature, thinking, as Bateson says, isn't the best tool. We know this must be true because nature was well organized and communicating with itself long before humans evolved and long before human thinking and language evolved. So there must be a mechanism which is which has a communication system, but it's not in human language. So the idea of thinking that we can understand nature through human language involves quite a lot of hubris, I think. So what Bateson explores this, the epistemological error. He says, we've gone down the wrong track. The major problems in the world are the result of the difference between how nature works and the way people think. And he also says the shapes of animals and plants are transforms of messages. So looking out the window, the plants in my garden, they're messages, they're communicating with me. If I knew how to read the language. And he talks about, this is Nora and, Mary Catherine and Gregory, talking about the reframe. If you want to talk about the living world and ourselves, we need to master this curious language which has no things in it, but only differences in relationships. And we're just talking in the breakout group about stamping out the nouns. So what happens when we do that? When we take away the nouns, we take away the things, and also the images. What are we left with? We're left with this kind of unusual place, kind of blank screen, as it were. And I suppose one of the things that kind of really took this to another level for me was coming across the work of Henri Corbin, who influenced James Hillman and Jung. And he describes the imaginal world. He also calls it active imagination, interesting enough, but that links in with the psychoanalytic work. And he discovered in Islamic literature a lost continent of language left out of Western epistemology. And he describes the world as existing between the sense perceptions and the concepts of the intellect, an emergent reality, which he calls the imaginal. Bateson calls it creatura, from a Gnostic philosophy, which is Western philosophy. But he also says that the whole thing about the imaginal world is it has its own cognitive function that gives us access to a region of being which without that function remains closed and forbidden to us. So there's a whole world, a lost continent we can access that's invisible, and we can't access it through thinking. So the third thing I was just going to touch on is this idea of change, bringing about change, systemic phase change. So, when we're working in a clinical room, we're looking for a breakthrough, or in our lives, we're looking for a breakthrough. And that's, we can think about, I've been thinking about that as systemic phase change. So the change where something is one thing and then it completely changes. So, training as a therapist, before I was a therapist, I was one thing, a teacher. After that, I'm a psychotherapist, and there was a complete change in my whole orientation, thinking, work, everything. And this is what happens in nature all the time, the change from a leaf to a flower to seed. So we can, and this was managed in indigenous cultures through nature-based rites of passage for adolescence. And most cultures had an intact adolescent nature-based rite of passage, which allowed young people to transition into adulthood. So if we widen the systemic lens to include transgenerational cultural practices that facilitate deep connection with the systemic intelligence of nature, reconnecting with the mothership, I can call that. We don't have any good words for that, but that's good enough. Transgenerational, because the rites of passage they crossed from generation to generation, because it was so important that people connected to nature. It was important that they were transgenerational. So in Aboriginal culture, there's this practice called Dardiri, a deep listening. And it's described, this is this Aboriginal lady called Auntie Miriam, who lives out in the bush and works with disaffected youth. She says it's an inner deep listening and quiet, still awareness, a tuning in experience to deeply understand the beauty of nature. So she's not thinking, it's not about content, it's about beauty. So it's not conceptualized, it's about beauty, about information that is in the beauty. And the Aboriginals say that they have the longest nature-based spiritual practice on the planet. 40,000, well, it's believed to be 40,000 years old. The Aboriginals say it's actually 100,000 years old. So that's something worth thinking about. And this is another thing I've explored from a Western culture. And again, there's quite a lot of information around this. What I call in my book, soul encounter beyond the borders of language. In other words, going beyond language to have an experience of the imaginal. And one of the ways to access this is reflective ritual solo time in nature for up to 4 days and nights, spending time in nature on your own, fasting. And this is the School of Lost Borders. Meredith Little is one of the founders of the School of Lost Borders, and it's a practice where you can touch into a deep connection with nature, and it's deeply transformational. It's not therapy, completely different from therapy, but it's therapeutic. So there's just a few ideas really to sort of get us thinking about the connection between systemic thinking and nature, and what we might be able, what we might be able to bring into the practice of systemic work.